Hey everybody, Aaron Rift here from NoDQ.com. Welcome to WCW Wednesday here on NoDQ.com. This week I will be looking back at the WCW pay-per-views from 1992 and 1993. You can watch these pay-per-views on the WWE Network for just, as of the recording of this video, $9.99. This was when wrestling was starting to lose popularity. You had the steroid scandal, you had other scandals. Wrestling was in the middle of a downturn starting around early 1992, and things would get worse before they got better. Definitely one of the dark periods in wrestling history, at least in modern wrestling history, coming off such a glory period of the late 1980s. First off, we had Super Brawl 2 at the Mecca in Milwaukee. This was the pay-per-view debut of Jesse Ventura, and to me this was a positive change with the commentary. It was a nice change of pace from Jim Ross and Tony Schiavone to babyface play-by-play announcers, essentially doing the same thing. So having a little bit of color added to the commentary was a nice change. Jesse Ventura made his debut, and the match that people remember the most from this pay-per-view is Jushin Thunder Liger versus Brian Pillman. This was a tremendous match, and it was very similar in ways to Randy Savage versus Ricky Steamboat from WrestleMania 3. It was a match that was ahead of its time. It was very fast-paced, and if anything, it was a prelude to the WCW Cruiserweight division, and this was for the light heavyweight title, but this match was the style that we would later see during the early years of Monday Nitro that would put WCW on the map and help put WCW on the map. Definitely, I would recommend checking out this match if you haven't seen it already. And from top to bottom, this was actually a very solid card, and I would give this a thumbs up as far as the quality of the pay-per-view as a whole. You had some good matches on this show. You had Barry Windham and Dustin Rhodes. I enjoyed these guys as a tag team. I thought that they worked really well together against Larry Zbyszko and stunning Steve Austin. So you had four great in-ring performers, and they had a very solid match. And speaking of solid performers, Rick Rude and Ricky Steamboat, definitely one of the more entertaining feuds of 1992 was between Rick Rude and Ricky Steamboat over the U.S. title. So I would recommend this one as well. You had the main event, Sting versus Lex Luger. This was actually not that good of a match, and I think a lot of it had to do with Lex Luger being on his way out of WCW, and he was already leaving and planning to go to WWE. So it didn't really have the quality that previous Sting and Lex Luger matches had up to that point. But it is historical. It is Sting's second title victory, and it was Lex Luger's last match in WCW and last appearance in WCW until the first edition of Monday Nitro. Next up, we have the Wrestle War 92 pay-per-view. Really, this was just a one-match show, but what a match it was. And I'm talking about the War Games match. Sting's team with Barry Windham, Dustin Rhodes, Nikita Koloff, and Ricky Steamboat against the Dangerous Alliance. A great faction for the time. I mean, you had a really strong lineup here. You had Arn Anderson, Beautiful Bobby, Larry Zbyszko, Rick Rude, and Steve Austin. So you really had a lot of star power for the time. You had some great heels, great baby faces, and a very violent match. And one of the last really good War Games matches that WCW had before they kind of went downhill in terms of the violence and the intensity in these matches. They really got watered down after this. This was one of the best War Game matches ever. So if you check out Wrestle War 92, make sure you check out the main event for sure. All right, moving on to Beach Blast 92. This was another turning point in WCW. Throughout WCW's history, there was a lot of turmoil. You had people coming in and out of management. At this point, you had another transitional period with Bill Watts coming in to run WCW, and he was very old school. He wanted to bring 1970s wrestling into 1992. Didn't work out. But there were a few highlights on this show. You had Sting versus Cactus Jack, Falls Count Anywhere. Excellent match. This was one of Cactus Jack's finest performances, and Sting gave his A game as well. You had a really entertaining feud with these guys leading up to this match. Definite thumbs up. Absolutely recommend you checking it out. And then you had a 30-minute Iron Man challenge, Ricky Steamboat versus Rick Rude. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, these two had great chemistry together. Their feud was very entertaining as well. And it wasn't the best Iron Man match of all time, but very solid work from both of these guys, and another thumbs up match. Next up, we have the 1992 Great American Bash. Wasn't a big fan of this pay-per-view from top to bottom. You had an NWA Tag Title Tournament, and as I mentioned in the previous WCW Wednesday when I was talking about tag team matches on WCW pay-per-views, I'm all for tag team wrestling, and I think that WCW overall did a good job with tag team wrestling over the years, but having a pay-per-view where almost every match is a tag team match, it gets old really fast in my opinion. And the crowd was dead for most of this show as well, and that did not help matters. There is one match I would recommend, and it's not a tag team match, for the WCW World Title, Big Van Vader versus Sting. Vader defeated Sting to become the WCW champion, and say what you will about WCW, but they did an excellent job booking Vader as a monster heel. And this match was really fun to watch, and WCW did it right in terms of building up Vader as this monster heel champion. So definitely check out this match. Moving on, we have Halloween Havoc 1992. This pay-per-view was quite the train wreck, to say the least. I mean, let's put it this way. You had the world title match between Ron Simmons and the Barbarian. Yes, the Barbarian, of all people, was in the world title match. Who booked this? We know who did. It was Bill Watts, but why? That's my big question. Terrible match. Crowd was dead for most of the show, just like they were the previous pay-per-view. You had Rick Rude versus Masahiro Chono. That match was a disaster. You had a few highlights on this show, I guess, but you had Brian Pillman versus Ricky Steamboat, which wasn't a tremendous match or anything, but it was the start of Brian Pillman's heel turn, and this would lead up to the formation of the Hollywood Blondes. So it was interesting to see Brian Pillman start to develop his heel character. And you had a non-wrestling segment, which was better than anything else on the entire show. You had a interview segment with Paul Heyman, Paulie Dangerously, and Medusa, and he was insulting her for being a woman. And this was tremendous mic work from Paulie Dangerously, and Medusa did a good job as well. And like I said, this was better than any of the wrestling matches on the entire show. And you had the main event, Spin the Wheel, Make the Deal, a coal miner's glove match between Sting and Jake the Snake Roberts. This was Sting's chance to redeem himself after losing the title to Vader. This was Jake Roberts' one and only WCW pay-per-view appearance, and he was on the downward spiral, not just in the ring, but in his personal life as well. And this was not a very good match at all. But it is significant because it was the one pay-per-view appearance of Jake Roberts. But really would not recommend this match or this pay-per-view as a whole. Moving on, we have Starrcade 1992. Once again, WCW is continuing to decline, not just in terms of popularity, but in terms of the quality of the product as well. This was Jim Ross's last pay-per-view appearance doing commentary. Once again, you had a show built around tag team matches, and most of the tag matches were not good. Essentially, this Battle Bowl, the whole concept was pretty much a dud. I mean, it could have been interesting where you have guys that are forced to team together, but when every match is basically the same type of booking, where two guys don't get along and somebody turns on the other guy, and you just repeat that over and over again, and you have guys that aren't used to teaming together either. So the quality of the match isn't what you would come to hope for, because you have two guys that are not used to working together, and they just go out there, the match is thrown together, and they normally are not very good. You did have a couple of solid matches on the show, though. You had the Unified World Tag Team title match with Ricky Steamboat and Shane Douglas against Barry Windham and Brian Pillman. This was an excellent match. Barry Windham had just made his big heel turn, and Brian Pillman had turned heel a few months prior. So, the two of them were really shining as heels, and Ricky Steamboat, classic babyface, along with Shane Douglas early on in his career. This was really solid work from all four guys. Very entertaining match. And you had the King of Cable tournament final, Sting versus Vader. Sting and Vader, every time they went out there, they delivered in the ring, and their feud was one of the big highlights of WCW during this period. So anytime you can see Sting versus Van Vader, make sure you check that out. All right, moving on here to 1993, we have the third edition of Super Brawl to kick off the year. This was a very newsworthy show, and one of the better WCW pay-per-views of the time, in my opinion. You had the Hollywood Blondes in their first pay-per-view match. You had Ric Flair making his big return to WCW. You had the British Bulldog making his first WCW pay-per-view appearance. You had the first pay-per-view appearance of Chris Benoit against Too Cold Scorpio, complete with Jesse Ventura on commentary saying that Chris Benoit has the killer instinct. That was interesting. You had a Falls Count Anywhere match, Cactus Jack versus Paul Orndorff. Cactus Jack once again delivering one of the best pay-per-view matches in WCW of the night. He was on fire at this time. He was always giving it his best performance. And you had a throwback match. You had the Rock and Roll Express against the Heavenly Bodies. Very old school 80s tag team match with Jim Cornette. So this was a lot of fun. You had the main event, once again, Sting versus Vader in a strap match. Kind of a goofy storyline leading up to it with the infamous White Castle of Fear. But the match itself was tremendous, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Sting and Vader on pay-per-view, they always delivered. So from top to bottom, this was a very interesting pay-per-view. So I would recommend checking out the whole pay-per-view. Next up, we have the first edition of Slamboree from 1993. The idea here was to start up a WCW Hall of Fame, and in addition to the Hall of Fame, you would have some of the legends performing in matches. This was not the best idea. Throwback matches are cool, like with the Rock and Roll Express, but here, bringing back guys from the 1970s was not a good idea. These guys came out and, could not perform at the level that they used to perform at, and you had a series of bad matches on this show. You had Sid's return to WCW. That was noteworthy. You had Nails from the WWF coming in as the prisoner, and the less said about this, the better. You had the Hollywood Blondes against Shane Douglas, supposed to be Shane Douglas, but he quit the company, and Ricky Steamboat under masks as Los Dos Hombres in a cage. The storyline was goofy, but the match itself was really good. And you had the main event, Vader versus the British Bulldog. Not a bad match, but you had a lame DQ finish on pay-per-view, which I'm not a big fan of. So this pay-per-view, for the most part, is skippable unless you want to see the WCW Hall of Fame segments. That's worth watching, I guess. Next up, we have Beach Blast 1993. This pay-per-view had a few good matches, but a lot of bad stuff as well. Hollywood Blondes, once again, one of the highlights of a WCW pay-per-view. You had the Blondes versus Arn Anderson and Paul Roma. Despite Paul Roma being in there, this was a fairly good match. largely due to the Blondes and Arn Anderson. You had Davey Boy Smith and Sting against Vader and Sid Vicious, the Masters of the Powerbomb. This was a fairly entertaining main event match. You had the star power, and I didn't really have any issues with this as a main event. But besides these two matches, there was really nothing else on this show that was of any significant quality. Moving on here, we have the 1993 edition of Fall Brawl. This was not a very good pay-per-view. A series of bad matches, lack of crowd heat. Crowd was dead for most of the show. You had Ric Flair versus Rick Rude, which I thought was a disappointing match. You had the War Games main event, which was not pretty. Not a very good War Games match. Not much to it. You had the Shockmaster involved, and let's just say that the Shockmaster's debut was more memorable than this War Games match. And it was Harlem Heat's first WCW pay-per-view appearance, but beyond that, this was a very forgettable edition of Fall Brawl, and this was the first Fall Brawl that was a pay-per-view in WCW. And next up, we have Halloween Havoc 93. This was a decent pay-per-view, maybe thumbs middle, something like that. Better card than Fall Brawl, better crowd heat. You had the main event, Vader versus Cactus Jack. Cactus Jack actually got the main event of a WCW pay-per-view, and another excellent match from both Cactus Jack and Vader. And the two of them, they always delivered in the ring. They had great chemistry, and this was a lot of fun to watch. You had Rick Rude versus Ric Flair in a rematch from Fall Brawl. This was better than the Fall Brawl match. Still not the match that I was hoping for from these two, but still better than average. It's worth checking out because of the star power. You had Paul Orndorff versus Ricky Steamboat. Paul Orndorff was really performing at a high level at this period in WCW, and Ricky Steamboat was great as usual. This was a slightly better than average match. This one's worth checking out. So those three matches I would recommend. Everything else you could probably skip. Next up, we have the Battle Bowl pay-per-view. This sucked. This was not a good pay-per-view. As I mentioned when I was talking about Starrcade and the Battle Bowl concept, same thing applies here. A bunch of bad matches with guys that don't usually work together, and your usual storyline where two guys are forced to team together and one guy leaves the other guy or turns on the other guy, whatever. Just a series of bad tag team matches throughout this show. The only highlight, in my opinion, was the end with the Battle Bowl match itself, the Battle Royal, and it was down to Sting and Vader at the end. And, same thing applies as I talked about with Sting and Vader. These two always delivered in the ring, and this was no exception. This was fun. Finally, we have Starrcade 93. And this was another turning point in WCW. This is when things were starting to move in the right direction for WCW finally. You had Eric Bischoff as the latest person to run WCW, and he seemed to have a clue. He seemed to have a vision of where to go with WCW. The story of this pay-per-view was Ric Flair versus Vader. Ric Flair put his career on the line in this match, and WCW did an excellent job with the storytelling here. They interviewed Ric Flair at his home with his kids, and you had Gene Okerlund and Ric Flair having a heart-to-heart talk. And then they arrived in a limo to the ring, and Ric Flair was very serious. It was a different Ric Flair than we were used to seeing, not the flashy styling and profiling. He was taking this match very seriously, and Vader had been booked as a monster heel for the past year and a half, so there was a lot of doubt that Ric Flair could actually beat Vader. Just basic storytelling here, but really well done in my opinion. This was Gene Okerlund had come in at Battle Bowl, but but Gene Okerlund added a lot to the WCW product with the interviews. And the only other noteworthy thing on this show was the debut of the Boss, Big Boss Man, coming in. And we were starting to see, like Gene Okerlund, we're starting to see more guys coming in from WWE, jumping ship to WCW. So you really felt like WCW was starting to gain some momentum with this pay-per-view, and things would definitely continue into 1994. But I'll get to that on the next video. If you enjoyed this video, share it on Facebook and Twitter, and I will see you guys next week for another edition of WCW Wednesday. Thanks for watching.